right, let's dive into a revolution that sent shockwaves across the world, huh? The Cuban Revolution. You've given us some really interesting sources, and we're going to break down how Cuba transformed from a haven for the wealthy to a symbol of resistance. It even had superpowers sweating a bit, right?
What's really fascinating about the Cuban Revolution is that it wasn't just some random, isolated event. To really understand its impact, we've got to grasp the complex web of social and political forces that were already in motion. It was almost inevitable, you know?
Okay, so set the stage for us. We're talking the 1950s. What's the scene in Cuba? Because it's not all just sunshine and salsa, is it?
Not exactly. Picture this. A tiny elite with more money than they know what to do with calling all the shots. And these guys, they're often chummy with American corporations, further complicating things. Meanwhile, the majority of Cubans are struggling just to get by. It was a recipe for, well, a major upheaval.
Sounds like a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
Yeah.
And that spark, am I right, it was that attack on the Moncada barracks.
You got it. July 26, 1953, that date's important. Fidel Castro and a small group of rebels, they thought they could grab some weapons, make a statement, maybe even spark a full-scale uprising. But militarily speaking, it was a complete flop.
Hold on, if it failed so badly, how did this become such a pivotal moment in Cuban history? Explain that one to me.
It's a perfect example of how even what we might call failures can have huge ripple effects. See, it was the sheer audacity of it all. This young lawyer, Castro, taking on a dictator head-on, it captured people's imaginations. And then there was his trial, where he famously declared, "History will absolve me." Pure legend. That's how Castro went from rebel to icon practically overnight, you see.
So it wasn't just about the action itself, it was about the message, the defiance. Okay, that makes sense. But a revolution needs more than just a figurehead, right? How did this thing actually gain traction? We're talking about taking down a dictator who had a serious grip on power.
Now that's where it gets even more interesting. Castro and his comrades, including a certain Argentinian doctor you might have heard of, Che Guevara, they realized they couldn't win a conventional fight against Batista's army, so they had to play it smart.
Enter guerrilla warfare. Right. I'm picturing those classic hit-and-run tactics using the element of surprise, the terrain, all of it to their advantage, like a David versus Goliath kind of thing.
Exactly. They disappeared into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, becoming practically one with the locals, and slowly chipped away at Batista's forces and his authority. But this wasn't just a military strategy, see? It was a social movement, too. They were offering a vision, a different future for Cuba.
And this Che Guevara, I mean, his name's basically synonymous with revolution.
Yeah.
What was his deal? Was he just muscle, or was there more to it?
Che was definitely more than just muscle. He was the brains behind a lot of the revolution's ideology. He was a committed Marxist, meaning he believed in, well, basically dismantling traditional power structures and creating a classless society where resources are shared equally. A pretty radical concept for sure.
Okay, so they've got the strategy, the message, the leadership. But Cuba in the 1950s, I'm not so sure it was a hotbed of radical thought. Were people really ready for this Marxist revolution thing?
Not everyone, at least not at first. But Castro, he was a master communicator. He knew how to tap into that deep well of frustration that was already there. Students, they were fed up with a rigged system. Farmers, they were yearning for land. And the workers, they were tired of being exploited.
So it became about more than just kicking out Batista, didn't it? It was about promising something better, something for people to really believe in.
Exactly. And this message, it resonated far beyond Cuba's shores, too. Remember, the world was in the middle of some massive changes. The dismantling of colonial empires, the Cold War heating up.
Ah, right. Totally forgot about the global context for a second there. The Cold War, that intense rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union, each trying to spread their own ideology. So Cuba, right there next to the US, it basically became a pawn in their game.
Exactly. Castro's revolution, it was timed perfectly to become a global symbol. For people fighting oppression all over the world, Cuba represented hope, a slap in the face to Western imperialism. And that's where things get really interesting. Picture this. January 1st, 1959. Batista, he realizes the game is up, so what does he do? Flees Cuba. And Castro and his revolutionaries, they roll into Havana, not as these guerrillas hiding out in the mountains anymore, but as victors.
Wow, I can only imagine what the atmosphere must have been like. Electric, probably. A whole new Cuba was being born.
It was pure exhilaration, at least for a lot of Cubans. But then, of course, comes the hard part, turning all those revolutionary ideals into a real, functioning country. And Castro's government, well, they didn't waste any time, nationalized industries, took land from those wealthy landowners, and redistributed it to farmers. Plus, they poured tons of resources into things like education and healthcare.
Okay, so some pretty radical changes happening really fast. I mean, that all sounds great for those who were struggling under the old system, but I'm guessing it also created some, well, let's say nervous citizens out of those who benefited from the previous setup.
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't some kind of, bloodless coup. There were executions, people who felt like their whole world had been turned upside down. Many fled the country, with most heading to the U.S.
Which brings us to the international drama, because I'm guessing the U.S. wasn't about to just sit back and watch all of this unfold peacefully.
Not a chance. The U.S. had always considered Cuba, well, pretty much within its sphere of influence. So to have a communist nation suddenly pop up right on their doorstep, let's just say it didn't go over well in Washington. They saw it as a threat, ideologically and strategically, especially with that whole Cold War thing going on.
Right, because now Cuba could potentially become a Soviet ally right there next to them. Talk about some geopolitical anxiety.
Right.
So what did the U.S. actually do about it?
Yeah. They went after Cuba's economy. The U.S. hit them with a trade embargo, essentially cutting them off from a major trading partner. It was a classic Cold War tactic, the idea being to cripple Cuba's economy and undermine Castro's government. They figured, make life difficult enough for everyday Cubans, and eventually they'd turn against Castro.
And did it work? Did they achieve what they set out to do?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The embargo definitely caused some serious hardship, no doubt about it. It forced Cuba to become more self-reliant, yeah, but it also led to shortages, stifled economic growth, and fueled a lot of resentment towards the U.S. But here's the kicker. It also gave Castro this powerful propaganda tool. He could just point to the embargo and say, see, the U.S. is trying to bully us into submission.
So it might have actually backfired a bit, huh?
Yeah.
Strengthening Castro's hold on power instead of weakening it. What a mess. But it gets even more complicated, doesn't it? Because those Cold War tensions, well, they were about to hit a boiling point.
That's an understatement. 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Things escalated dramatically. The Soviets, at Castro's invitation, started setting up nuclear missiles in Cuba. And just like that, the world was on the brink of nuclear war.
Okay, yeah. This I actually remember learning about in school. Talk about a terrifying standoff between superpowers.
It was Cold War brinkmanship at its finest. For 13 days, the entire world was holding its breath, wondering what would happen. Luckily, though, through some pretty intense negotiations and some very careful diplomacy, they managed to avert a crisis. But the Cuban Missile Crisis, it really showed everyone just how volatile the situation had become. It was a stark reminder, this little island nation, it was now a major player on the world stage.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. A revolution on this, relatively small island, and it practically brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Really shows you how these events, even ones that seem kind of isolated, can have massive global consequences.
Absolutely. The Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a wake-up call for everyone. The world was interconnected, whether they liked it or not. And a small island like Cuba, it could become a flashpoint in this global power struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union.
So we've talked about how the revolution started, the major players, those dramatic events, the international fallout. But what about life in Cuba after the revolution actually happened? Did Castro actually manage to create that utopian society he was always talking about?
Well, like most revolutions, the reality turned out to be a lot more complicated than the initial promises. On the one hand, you have Castro's government making some pretty significant progress, especially in areas like education and healthcare. Illiteracy was practically eradicated. Healthcare became accessible to everyone, regardless of whether they could pay or not. There was this real push to create a more equal society.
Those are some pretty impressive achievements, especially when you consider what Cuba was like before the revolution.
They were. But those achievements, they came with a price. Political dissent, not tolerated. Freedom of speech, restricted. Anyone who even seemed like they were criticizing the government, they faced some pretty serious consequences. So that dream of a more equal society, often overshadowed by the realities of living in a one-party state, unfortunately.
Sounds like a classic case of one step forward, two steps back. They made strides in social welfare, but at the same time, individual freedoms took a hit.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And then there's the whole issue of the U.S. embargo, still looming over everything. It's debatable how much it actually weakened Castro's grip on power, but there's no doubt it caused a lot of hardship for regular Cubans. basic necessities, often scarce. The economy, struggling. People had to get really creative just to make ends meet.
So it sounds like the legacy of the Cuban Revolution is this really complex, mixed bag, a story of progress and setbacks, triumphs and tragedies. Looking back on it all, what are the key takeaways? What can we learn from this incredibly tumultuous period in history?
I think the Cuban Revolution, just like any revolution, it reminds us that change is complicated. It's messy. It's not always pretty. It teaches us about the sheer power of ideas to get people moving, the allure of revolution, but also the often very sobering realities of what comes after. It's a story that continues to resonate, and not just in Cuba. All over the world, people are still grappling with these ideas.
It definitely leaves us with a lot more to think about than easy answers, that's for sure. A good reminder that history is rarely black and white. A lot of the time, the most important lessons are in those gray areas.
Exactly. The Cuban Revolution, it challenges us to really wrestle with some tough questions about how social change happens, the balance between individual liberty and the collective good, and this never-ending pursuit of a more just and equitable world.
So even decades later, the Cuban Revolution is still relevant today. It's not just a history lesson. It's a way for us to examine our own values and beliefs about things like power, equality, and the kind of world we want to build.
Exactly. And that, honestly, might be the most important takeaway of all.
I couldn't agree more. This has been a seriously fascinating deep dive into the Cuban Revolution. And to our listener, we encourage you to take a look at these sources yourself, dig deeper, question things, and come to your own conclusions about this pivotal moment in history. Until next time, keep asking those questions, keep seeking those answers, and keep diving deep.